Two people can chant the exact same words, Namu-myoho-renge-kyo, thousands of times, and end up with two completely different lives. The difference sits in what they believe they're doing when they say it. One viewer wrote in, she'd been taught properly, a real teacher, real gongyo, real daimoku. She said she still sees the same pitfall everyone else falls into. Nichiren gave that pitfall a name. He wrote it down, from exile to disciples who were losing everything. Here's what he called it: praying like you're placing an order, instead of like you're making a vow. Here's the shape of it. You start chanting for something specific, a job, a diagnosis to change, a relationship to hold together. Weeks pass, nothing moves. And somewhere in there, a quiet question starts running underneath everything. Is this actually working? There's a real word for what you're chasing there. Genzei ryaku, present life benefit. Nichiren never said to stop wanting it. Health, stability, a roof that isn't leaking, none of that is beneath the practice. So ask yourself honestly, when you sit down to chant, are you asking for something, or are you offering something? That's the line Nichiren drew. You're allowed to want something. What breaks it is needing that thing to arrive before you'll call your faith worth it. That's the bargain. And a bargain always has the same hidden clause. No payment, no deal. It sounds like a modern complaint. Comment sections, forums, people asking why chanting isn't working. But this isn't new. Nichiren watched his own students fall into exactly this, and it nearly finished all of them. September 12th, 1271. Soldiers came for Nichiren in Kamakura, led by a man named Hei no Seimon. By 6 that evening, he'd been sentenced to exile on Sado Island. That should have been the worst of it. Past midnight, guards marched him toward the beach at Tatsunokuchi, this time for execution. The blade was already raised when, by his own account, a bright orb tore across the sky, and the executioner froze. He survived. They moved him north instead. 6 weeks of travel, storms delaying the final crossing, until he reached Sado Island on October 28th. His quarters waited for him, a collapsing chapel inside a graveyard called Tsukahara, a place built to hold funerals, never meant to house anyone still breathing. No real walls, wind straight through the boards. That first winter, he nearly froze to death inside it. The man called Nichiren was decapitated last year on the 12th of the 9th month. His ghost has come here to Sado to live. Kaimokusho, the opening of the eyes, written from Sado, 1272. The Lotus Sutra promises its votary will be protected. Nichiren was freezing in a graveyard hut, waiting to see if that promise meant anything at all. While Nichiren was freezing on Sado, the same men came for the people who'd learned from him. Nichido, one of his closest students, was thrown into an underground cell. Nichiren had to write to him through the walls of a dungeon in a short letter now simply called Letter from the Dungeon. The lay disciples weren't monks. Most were samurai of modest rank, the kind whose entire livelihood ran through the shogunate. So the shogunate took it. Land, stipends, hereditary posts, stripped one by one from anyone who wouldn't recant. Here's how many held on. When I was in disfavor in Kamakura, 999 out of 1,000 followers lost faith. But now that the persecutions have lessened, these people have come back in repentance. Lesson Letter from Sado, 1272. Some of what happened next was worse than leaving quietly. Nichiren later wrote that men who'd once called themselves his students led whole congregations away with them, then became some of his loudest critics. A handful held their ground: Toki Jonin, Shijō Kingo, a lay nun named Nichimyo, losing exactly the same things everyone else was losing, and staying anyway. Nichiren had something to tell them, something most teachers never say to a struggling student. He told them what faith is actually for. First, he named something true about every person, his own students included. Human beings are equally vulnerable. They give their lives for shallow, worldly matters, but rarely for the Buddha's precious teachings. Letter from Sado, 1272, Sado Province. Then he compared his own suffering to iron being forged into a blade, heated, hammered, shaped by the very abuse meant to break it. Worthies and sages, he wrote, are tested by abuse. This was that test. Since nothing is more precious than life itself, one who dedicates one's life to Buddhist practice is certain to attain Buddhahood. Letter from Sado, 1272, Sado Province. That's the whole answer. Faith is what you're willing to spend your life on. Win or lose, results or none. That's the principle. But principles are easy to accept and hard to live. What does dedicating your life to this actually look like on an ordinary Tuesday, when nothing around you has changed? Nichiren had an answer for that too, one most practitioners never hear broken down. Nichiren actually gave two different names for what counts as an answer. The first is visible, immediate, the kind everyone recognizes. An illness lifts, a debt clears, a door opens exactly when you needed it to. Doctrine calls this kennel, conspicuous response. The second is slower, quieter. You don't feel it arrive because it doesn't arrive all at once. It accumulates. A steadier temper, a clearer head under pressure, the ability to survive a bad year without your whole identity collapsing. This one's called Myoho, inconspicuous response. This is where most people give up too early. They're scanning for kennu, the visible kind, and when it doesn't show up on schedule, they conclude nothing happened. Myoho doesn't announce itself. You usually only see it in hindsight, looking back at who you were a year ago. Saying that is easy. Living inside a bad year, trusting something invisible is building, that's the actual test. One of Nichiren's own disciples had to do exactly that, not as a thought experiment, as his actual life. In 1274, a samurai named Shijō Kingo tried to convert his own lord to Nichiren's teaching. His lord, Emma Mitsutoki, did not take it well. Jealous colleagues used the moment. They fed Lord Emma rumors, and Kingo's landholdings started shrinking. By June of 1277, it got worse. Kingo had only attended a public debate as a bystander, the Kuwagayatsu debate, but rivals told Lord Emma he'd shown up armed and violent. Lord Emma believed them. "Sign away your faith in the Lotus Sutra," he told Kingo, "or lose everything you own and get exiled to Echigo." Kingo's instinct was to fight it, to file a formal complaint, to defend his name. Instead, he sent his lord a written pledge of continued faith, and he sent Nichiren a letter instead of a lawsuit. Months later, Lord Emma fell seriously ill. Every other retainer he could have called on, he called Kingo instead. Kingo happened to be a trained physician. Kingo treated him. Emma recovered. And in 1278, the same lord who'd threatened to exile him restored Kingo's estate, then made it larger than it was before. The estate came back because Kingo's character held steady under real threat. That's the actual mechanism Nichiren pointed to. Unshaken conduct sustained long enough to outlast the crisis. Which raises the obvious problem. If every outcome, good or bad, can be explained as faith either working invisibly or being tested, when does anything actually count as proof of anything? That's a fair question. It deserves a real answer. Here's the test. Sincere reflection asks what you're supposed to learn or do next. Bypassing asks you to feel better about doing nothing. If the benefit is inconspicuous, becomes your reason to skip the doctor, avoid the hard conversation, or stop trying to fix the actual problem. The framework has turned into a hiding place. Every major branch of this practice agrees on that much, even where they disagree on everything else. Soka Gakkai calls it actual proof, visible change as evidence of inner transformation. Nichiren Shu folds it into devotion and discipline. Nichiren Shoshu splits it into conspicuous and inconspicuous benefit within a longer process of changing karma. Different vocabulary, same guardrail. The practice is supposed to produce a person who still takes responsible action. So this framework has real limits. It doesn't excuse anyone from responsible action. Which brings us to the actual question this whole video has been building toward. What counts as proof? Everything you need to go deeper is at NMRKOB.com, or follow the link in the description or pinned comment. Real proof looks like this. Standing at the end of a bad year, steady, clear-headed, still capable of choosing well. 3 years of pressure never turned Kingo bitter, dishonest, or reckless. The estate that eventually came back was only ever the visible trace of that. So here's the actual question worth sitting with, long after this video ends. When you kneel down to chant tonight, what are you bringing? A request or your life? If you want to go deeper than a single video allows, the daily practice library and community are linked below, built for exactly this kind of question. On Sado, Nichiren gave his life on purpose and called that the whole of faith.